Hello and welcome. Inflation in America is at an unbelievable 8.6%. The last time it was this high, I wasn't even born. What is inflation really at an intuitive level? How do interest rates affect it? And why do central banks find it so hard to increase interest rates? Keep watching to find out. Also check out the timestamps below. Feel free to skip to any chapter you like. I hope you enjoy. Inflation is nothing but rise in prices. For instance, say a house is listed at $1 million and it has one bid on it, sells at 1 million. No problem at all. If the same house has 50 bids on it, it's very likely to sell for a lot more than 1 million. That's inflation. So government increases the money supply a lot. Everybody has a lot of money and wants to buy a house. So 50 people bid on it. So what happened here is that the value of the house in terms of US dollars has increased. That's because there's more of US dollars now, but the same one house available. So the amount of US dollars has increased in comparison to the house. The house has not increased in terms of gold or oil or some other commodity. I don't know, if we had barter system, maybe we could buy a house and pay for it in gold or some other commodities. More formally, total spending divided by total goods. If the total spending increases but the total amount of goods remains the same, the prices increase, and vice versa. Now imagine the same thing happening across the whole economy. The total spending in the economy is made up of cash and credit. We buy stuff with either cash or on credit. In the US, actually, credit makes up the vast majority at $23 trillion. The actual currency in circulation is just $2 trillion. When the central bank increases interest rates, that makes it more expensive to buy things. That reduces spending by reducing the amount of credit in the economy. When you spend less, someone's income will be less because your spending is someone else's income. That person spends less and that in turn reduces the income of someone else, and so on and so forth. It has a cascading effect across the economy. This is called the multiplier effect. Let's say my income is $10,000 per month and I spend 80% of that. The $8,000 that I spend every month is an income for someone else, and that person spends 80% of their income, which is $6,400. Now this $6,400 is someone else's income in turn. You get the idea. Using a simple formula, we can calculate that my income of $10,000 has generated a total income of $50,000 across the economy through this multiplier effect. Now if my income reduces by $1,000 to $9,000 a month and I continue to spend 80% of my income, that reduces the income across the economy by $5,000. The impact of a fall of $1,000 in my income got multiplied by 5. I've simplified it and there's more to this idea, but that's the multiplier effect in summary. There are a lot of interest rates in the economy. The interest rate at which banks borrow from each other, the interest rates at which companies borrow from banks or from the market directly by issuing bonds, the interest rates at which you and I borrow from banks, either mortgage rates or auto loans or student loans or whatever. The Federal Reserve cannot increase all these interest rates directly. What it does is it raises the Fed funds rate, which is the rate at which banks borrow from each other for a very short while, overnight that is. And this increase in the Fed funds rate eventually trickles down to all the other interest rates in the economy. So reduce the interest rates, increase the spending and inflation, or increase the interest rates and reduce the inflation. So you might wonder, if there is inflation in the economy and inflation is a bad thing, why not just increase the interest rates? What's the problem? Why is it so hard? The problem is that increasing interest rates causes the economy to shrink, and that reduces the sales and profits of companies, which causes job losses. Nobody likes that. And also, the asset prices collapse. You're seeing that happening now. This happens because of the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve basically says that high inflation creates low employment. Though the graph on the y-axis says wage inflation, it applies to all kinds of inflation. Let's look at an example. Say an item, some widget sells now for $100 a piece. It sells for $100 next week and also the week after that. No problem at all. The consumer can buy at any time. There's no incentive to buy it now versus the next week or the week after that. Now, if the same $100 widget costs $105 next week and $110 the week after that, and the price keeps on increasing, there is an incentive to buy this widget now before the price increases. That increases the business of the company selling it, which will end up hiring more people, and their income increases, who will end up spending even more. So, though there is inflation in this second instance, the unemployment has reduced. And that's the intuition behind the Phillips curve. These days, the central bank in America has the independence to decide where on this graph the US economy should be. What kind of trade-off the economy should strike between inflation and unemployment. This was not always the case, and there were some consequences because of that. President Richard Nixon fired the then Federal Reserve Chairman William McKenzie and installed the presidential counselor Arthur Burns as his successor in early 1970s, 1 year after he was inaugurated as the president. Although the Fed is supposed to focus solely on money creation policies that promote growth without excessive inflation, Fed Chair Burns was forced to reduce interest rates by President Nixon so that the economy seemed strong as the voters went to cast ballots. William Grieder, in his book The Secret of the Temple, has quoted Nixon as saying, "We'll take inflation if necessary, but we can't take unemployment." That's exactly the trade-off Phillips curve talks about. It so turned out that President Nixon eventually had both inflation and unemployment. That caused the great inflation of 1970s in America. Prices actually started creeping up in mid-1960s when the federal government started spending on Vietnam and the Great Society. President Nixon temporarily froze prices in early 1970s, but that only postponed the pain. When the controls were lifted, the prices bounced even higher. In the 70s, Americans came to believe that inflation was here to stay, and that expectation became a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you are a business and you expect a 6% inflation, you are likely to set the prices for next year 6% higher. Your consumers will in turn set their prices 6% higher. Your employees, to keep up with the rising cost of living, will also ask for their wages to be increased. Inflation expectation is 6%. The actual inflation will also be 6%. This is why consumer expectations about inflations are so important and why the Federal Reserve keeps such a close eye on it. Once those are set, they are exceptionally hard to break. It becomes very hard for the Federal Reserve to regain its credibility about its intent and its ability to control inflation. Two American presidents publicly declared that inflation is the biggest problem facing the country. Gerald Ford even called it public enemy number one. But that couldn't change the high inflationary expectations of consumers. This hard problem was solved by Paul Volcker, who is now seen as God in the economic community. He did it by raising interest rates to almost 20%. It caused a recession. It raised the unemployment rate to 11%. Nearly 4 million people lost their jobs in two successive recessions in early 1980s. Paul even received threats and 2x4 cards on which construction workers wrote, "You stole my job," but the man persisted. Once inflation came down, it remained low over the next 4 decades. Ever since, America enjoyed a miraculously stable inflation rate of about 2% until recently. After this painful incident where everyone saw how far Fed would go to control inflation, they believed believe when the Fed says that it will control inflation. The European Central Bank does not have this kind of inflation fighting credentials. The inflation there keeps bouncing anywhere in between 2 and 6%. In Turkey, it's 6 and 30%. In Mexico, it's 2 and 30%. Credibility of the Fed matters. In case you're wondering if inflation encourages people to spend more and companies to hire more, which in turn increases incomes, let there be inflation. What's the problem? Why does it have to end? Why can't the party continue where people keep getting richer? The problem is that most of this spending is fueled by credit, and at some point the debt becomes so big that the interest on it begins to bite. There comes a point where the increase in the interest rate on your debt is more than the increase in your income. More and more of your income begins to go towards the servicing of the debt, and you will spend less. And as the spending reduces, because of the multiplier effect, the economy slows down and there might be a recession. Are we at the point where the consumer credit is unsustainably high? That is hard to answer, but what we can say with high confidence is that the amount of money that people are spending on buying stuff will reduce in future as the interest rates begin to raise and there will be a recession. Michael Burry is the man who saw the housing bubble coming in the US in early 2000s and made over $800 million by buying credit default swaps. He earned a spot in Michael Lewis's book The Big Shot and was played by Christian Bale in the movie adaptation. He tweeted two graphs on 27th May this year. The first graph is the consumer credit outstanding in the US, which is the amount of debt consumers have. For example, credit card debts. The second graph is personal savings in America. He said, and I quote, US personal savings fell to 2013 levels. The savings rate to 2008 level, while revolving credit card debt grew at a record-setting pace back to the pre-COVID peak, despite all those trillions of cash dropped in their laps. Looming, a consumer recession and more earnings trouble. Even though the US government just gave them $1.9 trillion very recently, the personal saving rate at 4.4% is as low as it was in 2008. Why are people doing this? Why are they spending so much? And why are they borrowing so much? It's not because of a failure of personal responsibility. It's because of inflation, as we saw earlier. Inflation encourages spending, and it's also beneficial to borrow when inflation is high. Let's go back to the $100 widget we discussed. Imagine that it now costs 100, 105 next week, 110 the week after that, and so on. But your savings are only 110 now. If you pay for that widget out of your personal savings, that will stop the runaway inflation right away. It will kill the inflation, because even if company keeps rising the price, there's no one to buy that product. So what companies normally do is they go easy on the prices, and that lets the consumer slowly build back their savings until they can afford that widget again. But runaway inflation will not stop if you pay for that widget with a loan. Here's why borrowing is beneficial during inflation. Say you borrow $100 at an interest rate of 8% and an inflation of 2%. After 1 year, the inflation adjusted amount you have to pay back is 106. Scenario 2. You borrow $100 at an interest rate of 5% and an inflation of also 5%. After 1 year, the effective amount that you have to pay back is only $100. Now let's consider scenario 3. You borrow $100 at an interest rate of 1% and an inflation rate of 9%. The effective amount that you have to pay back after 1 year is only $92. Consumers get this. When you combine consumer borrowing, which the high levels of inflation encourage, with the huge levels of government spending and the multiplier effect that it has on expanding the economy, you begin to understand why prices have gone up so much and things have gone so bad lately. So in conclusion, the Federal Reserve will be forced to increase the interest rates a lot. It will increase unemployment, it will crash consumer spending, and hopefully bring about a brief and controlled recession. I'm Sharat Mantravadi. Thanks for watching.